Hello and welcome to the very first episode of my new podcast, the Misinformation Podcast. I am Z, aka the Reluctant Accountant, and very excited to be here. As this is my first expedition, my first journey into solo podcasting, I'm very lonely. So thank you for joining me. Very, very happy to have you with me on this journey. And if you're new here, you don't know who I am, welcome. All people are welcome. So what are we going to do today? Very good question. So the idea behind this podcast is about taking those commonly kind of held beliefs, or maybe something that isn't a belief, something that you just didn't know about in the first instance. So what I want to do is look at some kind of stories, some fables, look at some of the kind of, as I said, fact behind the fiction, and bring you some new information. And hopefully along the way, we can debunk some of that misinformation that seems to be flying around. Hence the title of the show. So I wanted to ease us in, right? I didn't want to go straight for the gauntlet. I wanted to kind of deal with a topic that everyone can get behind, everyone knows a little bit about, everyone feels comfortable discussing. So you know what I thought I'd start with? Racism. Now, before everyone gets scared and running for the hills and be like, oh, we spoke about racism. It's you know what? Chill, calm down. As I said, I'm hoping to bring some sort of new angle to this. So bear with me. You may learn something. And even if you don't, you know what? You probably got half an hour to kill. So just kill it with me. Let's do this together. So we're going to talk about racism. I'm going to talk about racism. You're going to listen. Or you can shout at the phone or whatever device you're using to listen to me. I don't mind. Whatever makes you feel comfortable makes me feel good too. So what we're going to do and how I'm going to handle this is in a very specific way, though. It's not just going to be a general talk and, I'm not going to be like, oh, woe is me. I'm the victim of racism, blah, 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 as I very well have been. But that's not what I'm bringing here today. What I want us to look at is the economic cost of racism. And as I do this and as I record this episode, I'm very aware that I'm recording this against a backdrop of race riots that have taken place across the UK over a number of days this summer. And it's been very interesting time because the funny thing about this episode was I always had in my mind that this was going to be my first episode. So this was way before these guys got together and decided that, they've got nothing to do and let's just go and smash up stuff in a way of taking our country back and terrorize black and brown people across the country. Before they got there, before they had kind of had their AGM and decided this is what we're going to do, lads. This is how we're going to take our country back. Let's go steal some Greggs and some Lush products. Before they did that, I had this idea that I wanted to speak about this. And I wanted to speak about it in a very specific way because I think it's a way that isn't often spoken about. That's the first thing. And I think it's also a way that we can kind of acknowledge the emotion of a situation, but also take that out of it when we're looking at what is the truth about these things. And the reason I'm referencing these race riots because euphemistically they've also been called anti-immigration riots, and I find that very funny. Very funny way to describe, and that's what's often happened because this discourse around immigration is a political one, right? It's framed in economic terms, but it's often very much just to support political ideology or used as a distraction technique to distract people from their economic reality, the reality that they experience because of the government. We're kind of, we've got these scapegoats. We can blame these immigrants. So these anti-immigration riots and racist riots or whatever have taken place. And so I want to look at immigration to start with, the impact of immigration, the economic impact of low-wage immigration, to be very precise. As I said, because it's often used as this kind of proxy to kind of speak about racism. It's fine. I'm just talking about immigration, which is a legitimate political policy. It's not that I'm racist. It's not that I'm promoting xenophobia. So we're going to deal with that to start with. Second of all, I want to look at economic growth and what is the role that racism plays in impeding economic growth. So I've got some study. I've got a study, a very good one that I'm going to reference when it comes to that. And then finally, I'm just going to talk about, I'm going to all lives matter this a little bit. And I'm going to talk about how racism ultimately just impacts everybody. If you have these entrenched views, you don't exist in a vacuum. We exist in a society, whether you want to or not. And what impacts your neighbor will eventually come and land at your doorstep. As we used to say, the shit will roll down the hill. And that's where we are. So when I talk about immigration, and when we talk about immigration, and whenever it just comes up, there's a very specific language that is kind of coded and used when politicians in particular, but the media class, want to speak about it. And if you look, you will see in the newspapers things like, you know, swarms or flooding. There'll be adjectives such as we're inundated and the strain of immigration, and all of these very emotive terms which have a very, very, very definite goal, right? They've got a clear objective, and anyone that's paying attention can see that. And certainly the events that have taken place during this summer make it evident what that kind of final objective is, despite the fact that people are now trying to distance themselves from the language they use and the behavior that was the result of that language. Because incitement, apparently we only recognize it in certain forms in this country. I'll come to that another time. But what I wanted to talk about from an economic perspective is this idea of a natural experiment. So if you're unaware of what a natural experiment is, I'm going to explain it to you, because I'm not going to leave you out here hanging, just going Googling everything. I want you to stay with the podcast. I want you to stay on this channel so that you can understand things. So what is a natural experiment? A natural experiment is an observational study that uses conditions determined by nature or other external factors to expose individuals to experimental and controlled conditions. So what does that mean? What does that mean, Z? What does that mean? Very good. What it means is basically it's something that's naturally occurred, right? And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's naturally occurred in the sense that, you know, there's a natural occurrence like a hurricane or a storm. Yeah, certainly that could be used in a natural experiment, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's natural as in occurring from nature. It can be, as it says, from external factors. So it could be a law that's put in place. So one example of that would be the smoking ban, for example. But there is a time before the smoking ban and there was a time after it. And if you wanted to look at something in particular, I don't know, and you compare those time periods, you could do that because it's something that just occurred within society. It was an external factor. It wasn't something that they created in a lab. They didn't get a control group of smokers and get them to stop smoking. They you know, or get them to stop smoking in certain areas. Am I making sense? I hope I'm making sense. I'm sure I am. And if I'm not, like, you know what, comment and tell me that I'm not making sense. That's fine. But yeah, so this is what this natural experiment is. And so that's kind of one of the gold standards that you can have, especially when you're looking at economics, right? Because we'll get into it another time, but it's one of those things that they can kind of go, oh, like, but this naturally occurred. We haven't manipulated it. We haven't done whatever. And so we do have a natural experiment when it comes to immigration. So I want you to cast your minds back to the 80s, all right? It's 1980, it's Cuba, it's April. Things are going not so well for Castro. Fidel Castro and his revolution are like 20 years deep, and as with all relationships, after 20 years, it's not necessarily going to be going in exactly the way that you may have hoped. There have been economic problems in the country. People are unhappy. Some people are being classed as counter-revolutionaries. It's not as our revolution or as a revolutionary may have wanted it to be. And so some of these dissidents are like, I need to get out of this place. I need to leave Cuba. I need to try and claim asylum. And so they start doing that. They start trying to like go to different embassies. So there'll be like the Venezuelan one. They went to the Argentinian embassy. They went to the Peruvian embassy. And we'll hold up on that Peruvian one because what was happening also, and it was kind of frustrating Castro, was that these embassies were kind of allowing these people more or less to claim asylum. And he's like, this is outrageous. This is outrageous. Now, remember how an embassy basically operates. It's essentially another country within a country. So once you're on embassy property, you're actually in the country of that embassy. So what happens? It's the 1st of April. It's not an April Fool's joke though. It's 1980, and a bunch of Cubans, they go and they get this bus. And they get in this bus and they're like, bam, they crash into the Peruvian embassy. I don't know if it was a bam. I'm sure it was a bit louder, but you get the image. You know, I'm trying to be onomatopoeic a little bit here. So just ride with me or ride on the bus. So they crash into the Peruvian embassy and they're seeking asylum. And Castro's furious at this point, you know, because this is not what you want. If you've got a revolution and you need people to buy into it, you can't have dissidents and you can't have people like crashing into embassies and begging to be let out. So he's like, you know what? They are not political dissidents. They are criminals and they can't leave this island. So what ensues is a lot of back and forth. An international incident is created. And then he turns around and he's like, you know what? Fine. You want to go? Go. We don't need you. We don't want you here.
No los queremos. No los necesitamos.
he has this period where he's like, cool, if you want to go, just get out. And so people do leave. So what happens in this period is called El Mariel boatlift. Between April 1980 and October 1980, 125,000 Cubans leave Cuba, destined for the United States of America. And if this sounds kind of familiar, you're like, oh, I feel like I've seen or heard something about this. Well, say hello to my little friend. Yes, this is the beginning of the movie Scarface, where you see Tony Montana leaving Cuba and going off to Miami to start his wonderful pharmaceutical empire, when he also goes slightly crazy. So yeah, that's the opening scenes for that. So we have this natural experiment. That's essentially what that is. That's a period of 7 months of mass immigration into the United States. And so David Card, the economist, studied this, and he studied what the impact of this low-waged immigration was on the US. And what he found is that the impact on the native-born population was negligible. Averaged out as almost zero, but when it came to kind of low-wage native people, there wasn't a significant impact on their circumstance. And if you think about that, that logically makes sense. When people go to a place, they don't just go there in a vacuum. And this idea of just like stealing a job, as though jobs are just left lying around, or, you know, like the job wasn't locked up properly to the fence. And so this immigrant, this crafty Cuban immigrant came up, salsa in his way, and just took like that doesn't happen. So if people do get jobs, and they do get jobs, they also look for housing. They also need to buy stuff. They also look for entertainment. And all of that is money that's in the economy that helps to grow this economy. So this idea that people just come and exist in this vacuum where they're just sucking things into it, sucking all the jobs and all the benefits, is ridiculous. Now, this study has been, replicated, it's been looked over, it's been peer reviewed, and there is a general consensus within the economic community that study was right. Like the results and the output from that study was right. And actually there's a Nobel Prize winning economist, French-American lady, Esther Duflo, who has a book called Good Economics for Hard Times. And she speaks about this a lot, and she speaks about the impact of immigration, automation, and trade on workers, as well as this rise of like nativism and xenophobia. Now, there is a dissenting voice, because there's always one. And I must hasten to add that this dissenting voice is very much a darling of the right-wing media. So you say what you will about their motivations and the legitimacy of this dissent. But George Borjas, and yes, he is a Cuban immigrant himself, but he wanted to, hoist up that ladder and be like, I'm here, none of you are coming here. Okay, so he believes in curbing immigration. But as I said, the right-wing grift is very strong. And despite the fact that he also was in the group of economists that, despite all their egos, came to this consensus and largely agreed with the David Card study, he's since backtracked on that because the money is in right-wing populism. So good luck to him, and I'm really happy for him. So I'm not going to pretend that there aren't any problems with immigration. There are problems with anything, okay? There are problems with just moving house. But unless we can really look at the reality, the economic reality of these things, rather than just wrapping ourselves up in political ideology, we won't be able to have a legitimate conversation about these things and a real discourse about, if there are problems that need to be addressed, how to address those. So living under capitalism, you will always hear this idea about like economic growth being the really important thing that we need to do, apart from, ripping people off. But that one's not explicit. But economic growth, that's something that you hear a lot of the time, right? You'll hear about GDP. There are people that I'm sure that use the term GDP. I have no idea what that acronym stands for, but they use GDP because they know what we need is for GDP to go up. And so this is something that economists have said, what you need is economic growth. We need to stimulate the economy. It's everywhere. It's everywhere. To the point where I feel like there must be some sort of economic growth oil that we could start kind of grifting and selling to people and just be like, just rub this on the economy and stimulate the follicles and everything's going to grow. But anyway, I digress. So we have this like economic growth, and the ways that for decades it was accepted that you grow the economy was like by investment. So you invest in labor or you invest in capital. And then along comes another economist, Paul Romer this time. Paul Romer, who's won a Nobel Prize, says actually there's a third way. There's innovation as well. Don't forget about innovation. So this third way, and that again makes sense. If people have ideas and create new things, again, just like immigrants coming in, create jobs because they need new stuff, ideas and innovation create jobs, create stimulation for the economy. And we see this as well. We see that this has been accepted because you have things like an innovation grant, you can have research and development grant, you have these tax breaks that are for entrepreneurs, you'll have patent laws to protect these ideas. And so when you have these ideas and you want to stimulate the economy, this all makes sense. But what happens if you stifle that? What happens when you start to stifle innovation? And what happens when that stifling is targeted at a very specific group? So enter Lisa Cook. Now, Lisa Cook is an economist, and she's also, notably, the first African-American woman, and indeed woman of color, to be a member of the US Federal Reserve Board of Governors. I got that right because there was a lot of words going on there. But yes, so Lisa Cook, she's about it, right? She's that girl. She's her. And Lisa Cook published a study in the Journal for Economic Growth, which was entitled Violence and Economic Activity, Evidence from African American Patents Between 1870 and 1940. So what Lisa sought to do was look at what the impact of violence against the African American community, what impact that had on them registering patents. Because if we're looking at patents, the registering of patents as a proxy for innovation, then is there a correlation between African Americans feeling safe and feeling in an environment when they can be creative and whatever, between that and how much they innovate, how much they create? And so what she did was she charted this period of 70 years and she looked at those times of heightened violence against African American community. And unfortunately, it's something that is very easy for most of us to do because there are so many incidences that would be between those 40 years and beyond that of times when that community was specifically targeted. And what she found was that there was a direct correlation. So there was a correlation between, these spikes in violence above the unfortunate, normal kind of every day-to-day violence that they would encounter. These spikes in violence resulted in fewer patents being registered by African Americans. And what she extrapolated from that was that the world missed out on 1,100 patents being registered from the African American community. And if you think about that, that seems so obvious, right? It seems like such an obvious thing because I don't know about you, but like sometimes I'll wake up in the morning and like I'll run out of, I'd say I run out of toothpaste. And I can just go to the shop and get toothpaste. And yes, you may think I'm dramatic, and I am, so I'll accept that. But I'll be like, it's going to be a bad day. This is going to be a bad day. So one thing I don't think when I've run out of toothpaste is like, oh, I've run out of toothpaste. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to improve flight. I'm going to improve the longevity of a light bulb. I'm going to make sure that I invent some tights that don't have holes in it. I don't do that. And that's just from not having toothpaste. And I know that seems very trivial and very frivolous, and I try to live my life in that way. But I can only imagine the gravity and the sheer anxiety that I would feel living under this, perpetual cycle of heightened violence and increased violence that threatened my actual survival and existence rather than just my dental hygiene. Like, ridiculous. And so this is something that we often don't consider when we talk about this kind of civil unrest and this racism and this violence. It's often left out of the discourse when we're talking about these impacts, not only on that person in terms of their personhood, in terms of their physical safety or their mental safety, but what that opportunity that we're missing on the greatness that's within them because we don't get to see it. And so for this final thing, I want us to cast our minds back to 2008. Now, I don't know where you were in 2008. Some of you probably were in primary school. Hi to the Gen Zs. Some of you were probably wondering still about the millennium bug and if there was some sort of latent effect from the 2000s when we all feared. And some of you, possibly like me, were working in 2008. For all of our sins. And as you may know, because I've referred to myself as the reluctant accountant, I am an accountant, and I was working for the great institution of KPMG at the time, and I was at a convention in Athens in Greece. So I was surrounded by, before you get excited and be like, oh, look at her, she's had a good life. No, babes. I was surrounded by other accountants, so it was a riot. Yeah. Anyway, so I was at this convention, and 2008 has occurred, and we're kind of glued to our screens because obviously they're talking about spreadsheets. No, they're not. We're glued to our screens because 2008, what we are seeing on the television is what we thought we'd never see, that banks are failing, the demise of banking. We're seeing bankers walking out with their bankers' boxes filled with their kind of professional whole life within those boxes. We're seeing people saying, how did this happen? How did this happen? There's also whispers of, like rumors going around about, oh, well, thank God we're accountants because people always need to. Yeah, this was true. Oh, well, people have always got to pay taxes, so we'll always have a job. Probably not the time to bring that up, but, accountants are morons. And I'm including myself in this, by the way, just before anyone's, no, we're not. We are a little bit. Come on, let's be honest. So yeah, we were kind of looking at these things and being like, this is crazy. How could this happen? Like, whatever. And I think now, especially with, that benefit of hindsight, we kind of know the things that fed into this. So we know about the greed, and there was a lack of regulation and all of these other things. And this is really interesting because the way I get to this part of the episode is actually based on Lisa Cook. So when I learned about Lisa Cook and her work to do with patent racism, for want of a better word, I did a video about it, a small video on TikTok, on social media. And when I did that video, someone had commented, oh, you should read The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee. So I was like, what? And I love a recommendation, I love a recommendation. So I scurried off. I didn't scurry anywhere because it's 2024, so I could just open my phone. And I found the book, and I got the book, and I read it, and I was like, great recommendation. So shout outs to that person. I don't remember what your name was, but shout outs to you. So I read this book, and it was just really, really interested. So the title of the book is Heather McGhee, The Sum of Us, What Racism Cost Everyone, and How We Can Prosper Together. Now, because there was this cost element in it, I was like, economic data. And she does have economic data, but what she also looks at, which I found very interesting, was the psychology. So she looks at this kind of psychology of this zero-sum predominant mindset that exists among white Americans in a way that it doesn't as much exist among African Americans and Americans of color. And what that means, this zero-sum game, it means that people are quite willing to cut off their nose to spite their face. And this was really interesting for her because Heather McGhee she's an African-American woman, and she works in policy advocacy. And so she was really confused. Like, why are these people voting against their own interest? And it's that whole kind of leopard eating face party thing, right? Like, why are they consistently voting against things that will help them? And again, it comes down to this psychology and this zero-sum mindset. So within the book, she looks at things like, okay, so let me just give some context for people that don't know. I mean, I'm sure people know this, but we all know about the kind of US civil rights movement and this push from the African-American community to essentially be afforded the rights that they deserve, right? So they're taxpayers, they're working hard, they're contributing to society, but they don't have equal access to the resources of society. So to the public libraries and to public spaces and to swimming pools and such. And so they start fighting for those. They're like, we pay taxes. We're paying taxes that fund these things. We should have access to those things. And so in many cases, what a lot of municipalities decided to do, rather than give African Americans, Black people equal access to the things that they paid for, they were like, no one has it. We're going to drain the swimming pools. We're going to close down the public libraries. And that is that zero-sum mindset. And so this is something that, and it's a really, really good book. I definitely recommend that you go and have a read of it if you haven't. This is something that she charts through the book, through different kind of, she goes through different things, right? So, but one of the things that was really, really interesting was she talks about how in the 1990s, so in the 90s, it sounds so old saying that sometimes, doesn't it? 19, because these Gen Z are like, you were born in the 19s? Or they start calling it the 1900s. Anyway, I'll move on. But in the 1990s, there were these subprime lending practices. And so that word subprime lending is kind of coded in a way, because when we looked at the failure and the demise of the big banks in this global financial crisis, there was this tendency to, yes, go, oh, you know what, the banks were greedy, but we expect banks to be greedy. The banks were greedy and they maybe kind of played fast and loose with people's money. But you know what? You know who also is at fault? Those people that borrowed. They should never have borrowed. They didn't have enough money. They should know. They need to accept some personal responsibility, yada, yada, yada. And that was kind of one of the predominant things that came out of it as well. So we saw that happening. And so actually, if you go back to the 90s and you looked at the predatory lending practices, because that's what kind of started this thing, it wasn't necessarily about these people being subprime. The majority of borrowers were actually prime borrowers, which meant that they had good credit scores and they should have had access to more affordable loans. But what are they really going to do? Are they going to give you a loan for 9% if they can, or 6%? Like, you know, that's what they're going to do. So that's what they did. They gave these subprime loans to people that should have been able to afford, or should have been able to be, offered prime loans. But also among those people, there was this idea that it was just like these people that were just desperate to get on the housing ladder. But actually a lot of them were homeowners and had been paying their mortgage, you know, pretty well. And they had been approached about these loans, right? So these were homeowners that eventually had their equity stripped. And so what's interesting about that is that the big target initially for these subprime loans were black homeowners. So black homeowners in the 90s were being targeted by these predatory lenders, and activists in the 90s begged, lobbied, and tried to get the regulators to do something. And the regulators did nothing. They did nothing. So if you think about it, these black homeowners were the canaries in the cave. They were singing, they smelt the gas, they knew that this thing was going to blow, and nobody wanted to listen because, you know what? Racism. And that feeds into that stereotype. You know, black people are just bad with money and they're just lazy and they're just complaining and they don't want to, you know, be accountable for all of these issues. And look what happened. Look what happened and look what the fallout of that was. And it said that 8 million jobs were lost as a result of the global financial crisis, and 19 trillion in household wealth was wiped away, completely wiped away. It's just funny because when I think about it, I think about the fact that in modern times, this must be one of the most costly examples. And I'm happy to be proven wrong. I'm sure someone will be in the comments if they need to be with a well, actually, but must be one of the most costly examples in modern times of racism ultimately costing everyone so much. And it seems like a very simplistic answer, and that is not discounting the other factors that contributed to what was this global financial crisis and the fallout of this. But I'll say two things. The first thing is that it's 2024 and we are still experiencing the effects of this, the impacts of this. The legacy of this has not gone away and has been by no means been repaired. But the other thing is, perhaps this could have been different if when those practices were highlighted by the African American community, action was taken to have some sort of robust framework of regulation, and it wasn't just left to get to where it got to. Well, that's all I've got time for today's episode. That has been okay. I think we did okay, guys. I think you've survived it, and I'm really proud of you. So thank you for joining me for this first episode. It's been very different, but I think we got there in the end. If you are wanting to get in touch with me, please don't. I'm very busy. No, I'm joking. If you want to catch me on social media, you can find me at The Reluctant Accountant. I'm on TikTok until they ban me, and I'm on Instagram as well. So best probably follow me there because they're less inclined to be banning me anytime soon. I'm also obviously on YouTube at The Reluctant Accountant, where you can view this as a video if you're not already watching it there. And final thing, if you want to get in touch and you want to be like, you should do this as an episode, you should do that, or you just want to tell me how great you think I am, or just the opposite, how great you don't think I am, please feel free to get in touch. My email is the misinformation podcast at gmail. That's the miss with 2 S's, information podcast at gmail.com. But until next week, goodbye, good luck, and I'll see you then.